In this lesson, you will learn about some of the use cases for graphs. As you learned previously, the fundamental structure of a graph has applications far beyond mathematics. In fact, you may have seen the phrase "graphs are everywhere" across the Neo4j website. Neo4j hosts a site that contains example graphs that have been designed by Neo4j engineers and Neo4j community members. Many developers use GraphGists as a starting point for their own graph data model. You can browse the GraphGists by use case or by industry. Next, we will explore some common use cases for graphs. The first GraphGist we will look at is for e-commerce and real-time recommendations. Many online stores are traditionally built and run on relational databases, but by adding a graph database, either as a primary data store or as an additional data store, we can start to serve real-time recommendations. The first area that can be improved in e-commerce is the category hierarchy. To find products in a parent and subsequent child categories can be difficult in a traditional SQL query or require the duplication of data. Conversely, this can be represented in a couple of lines of cipher. You may be familiar with the people who bought product A also bought sections of your favorite online store. These types of recommendations can be computationally expensive to generate due to the large amount of data that needs to be held in memory. This creates the need for batch processes to be deployed in order to generate the recommendations. Where graph databases have the advantage in this use case is that a much smaller proportion of the graph needs to be traversed in order to generate the recommendation. You can simply traverse from one product node through the users who have purchased that product and onwards to the subsequent products that have been bought. Given the existing data in the graph about customers, orders, and products, we can infer the rating for a product based upon the number of times the customer ordered a product. The next use case we will look at is investigative journalism. The most prominent user of Neo4j for investigative journalism is the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ. One such graph that was created by the ICIJ was the Panama Papers. The purpose of this graph was to identify possible corruption based upon the relationships between people, companies, and most importantly, financial institutions. We have a subset of the Panama Papers investigation in a Neo4j GraphGist, representing the family of the Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev. The purpose of this graph is to enable one to answer these questions. Another graph that has been created by the ICIJ contains information on almost 350,000 offshore entities that are part of the Paradise and Panama Papers and the offshore leaks investigations. The offshore leaks data exposes a set of connections between people and offshore entities. You can play with this graph by creating a Paradise Paper sandbox and querying the data. Next, let's look at the network and IT operations use case. Many enterprises use Neo4j to help them understand how information flows through a system and how components of a network are related. This is useful for planning, analysis of costs, and also to troubleshoot problems when a problem arises. One of our Neo4j community members contributed this sample data model to demonstrate how one might use a graph to identify network dependencies. Here is the data model. You can use this type of data model to answer these questions. Finally, let's look at a supply chain management use case. Here is an example data model contributed by a Neo4j community member related to supply chain management. Entities that are modeled include raw suppliers, products, wholesalers, and retailers. All of these entities are located somewhere, and there is a distance between them that will impact how quickly products can be transported. With this graph, one can answer these questions. This completes our look at some of the use cases for graphs.